Hey everyone, this is Aaron with Vanishing Cabinets, and in this video I'll be building a couple of white oak nightstands and a matching desk, both with some pretty sleek waterfall edges, so stick around to check out the process. These nightstands and the desk are actually part of a full bedroom set, which also included a queen-size bed. And since that build was a bit more involved, I had that as a separate video I put out earlier. The main thing that makes all of these pieces matching really is the white oak theme, but I also had this common inlay across all the pieces where I basically had this striped pattern of purple heart inlay, which you'll see later as part of the drawer fronts. I'm starting with the nightstands here, and these are going to be made out of white oak veneered 3/4 inch MDF. And to accomplish the waterfall look, I'm cutting the edges of the side panels and top panel at 45 degrees, and I'm making those cuts with my table saw. A couple important things with this step. First, I'm using feather boards to keep the workpiece down and into the fence as I make these cuts, because it's really important that these cuts are made as precise as possible and having those edges nice and crisp and straight. Also, for the waterfall edge look to work, I'm making sure that the pieces I'm using for the sides and tops are all aligned in the same way they were originally on the longer strip. That way the grain looks continuous, and when I'm making these cuts, I'm really just trying to remove as little material as possible between the pieces so I don't create any large gaps in the grain pattern. I butted the 45-degree edged tips together tightly for the top and side panels, and then added some tape along the joints, and then just added a couple extra strips along the length of the panels for some more strength. Quick rundown on all the dado grooves I cut into these panels. First, here are the miter cuts that will make the waterfall edges along the top corners. Then here are the grooves for the middle divider panel that will separate the drawer section from the open shelf. Then here are the grooves or rabbets for the bottom panel. And then finally, I have a continuous rabbet along the back edge of all the panels so I can have the back panel recessed in. I have found, so far anyway, that making grooves for all the components really makes the assembly go a lot smoother. Really because the grooves allow the pieces to stay in place nicely during assembly. It's probably a bit slower than, let's say, like pocket holes or something like that, but for me, I just really like the look of this better, and honestly, once you have the dado stack set up, it's pretty easy to just batch out the cuts. Plus, I don't think I mentioned it before, but one thing that has helped clean up my cuts lately is using this bow table saw fence system. Not sponsored or anything, but I really do like it. It extends the fence and you get in-feed and out-feed support, and it keeps the pieces nice and secure when pushing the work pieces through. It's still not as good as like a large cabinet saw probably, but I have found that it really makes my cuts better and it's really been great for projects like this. After using all the pipe clamps and parallel clamps I had available to clamp the pieces together, I came back the next day, and after the glue dried, I was pretty happy with how these joints came together. I took a screwdriver and just lightly softened the edges to close any small gaps, but that was basically all I had to do. Oh yeah, and scrape the glue with a chisel. My initial design was to have these as floating nightstands. Basically, they would be mounted on the wall with a French cleat, and that is why I have a gap here in the back panel. The idea was to have the other end of the French cleat that was mounted to the studs on the wall sit in that gap. I would come to realize later, though, that that wasn't going to be possible with the placing of the outlets and wall paneling and stuff near the bed at the client's house. So I did end up adding some legs that I'll be showing a bit later. Next, to address the exposed MDF core plywood, I ended up basically making some edge banding from solid white oak. I didn't get footage of this, but I just made a 20-degree chamfer along the front edge of the edge banding strips, and I just did that on the table saw. It's always hard to get the edge banding and the side panels to look like one continuous piece of wood, but one thing I like to do is add a copious amount of white oak filler in the gaps just to help hide the transitions. While I let the wood filler dry, I got to work on the drawers, and I'm making these out of maple. I don't know how much wood costs in other parts of the country, but here in New Mexico, white oak is definitely on the higher end, and maple is less than half the cost of white oak. And for something like drawers, I don't want to completely go on the cheap and use plywood, but these won't be seen from the outside, so maple for me is a good middle ground. Plus, I actually really like the way they look, and maple is very easy to work with. I cut some rabbets on the two side pieces for the joinery, and I cut out a groove on the table saw for the bottom panel, about a 1/4 inch from the bottom. And this is my preferred method these days. It goes pretty fast and the box is very solid, and the joints come together nicely every time. My edge banding had a slight overhang in the drawer opening, so I did have to add a couple of 1/4 inch spacers to make sure that the side mount drawer slides would be clear of the overhang. And since this is going to be a frameless look, the drawer fronts are going to be sitting inset, meaning they're going to be flush to the front edge of the nightstand. So I mounted the slides about 3/4 of an inch back from the front edge to account for the thickness of the drawer front. The extra bit of flair I wanted to add to these nightstands was in the drawer fronts, and I mentioned earlier that this Purple Heart inlay stripe pattern was going to be the common theme across all the furniture pieces for this bedroom. And to make this inlay, I started by cutting out the small inlay strips of Purple Heart on the table saw using a thin strip cutting jig. And then I cut out 4 grooves for the inlay on some white oak using the table saw, and I purposely just cut the strips of Purple Heart at the thickness of my table saw blade. That way I could just do 1 pass per groove. And again, this bow table saw fence system really helped a ton to get these grooves consistent. Not required, but definitely helpful. I still consider myself an amateur when it comes to furniture building, especially after seeing all the crazy craftsmanship on YouTube. And it is pretty easy to get discouraged, but one thing that keeps me going is that I can say that the clients I build this stuff for at least appear to be happy with the products, and that is definitely more satisfaction than I ever got from my job in banking. When I quit my job 7 months ago, I thought that YouTube was going to be paying all the bills, which is nowhere close to how it's gone. I mean, there's so many great YouTubers out there hustling, and the competition is insane. But I still do enjoy making the videos as a hobby, and hopefully a handful of folks out there still enjoy these videos. So I just want to say thanks for watching. Here I am using some super glue to temporarily hold the drawer fronts in place so I can pull the drawer out and drive some screws in from the back. It was actually really convenient having that open space in the back for the French cleat that will never be used to be able to push the drawer out for this. I left a slightly larger gap on the top where I'll eventually have a low profile drawer pull. No project would be complete without a marathon of sanding, just making sure not to sand through the veneer. And after finishing that, I shifted my attention to making the desk. The design and construction of the desk is actually really similar to the nightstands, just different dimensions and a slightly different layout. I'm actually making the 45-degree cuts with the track saw instead of the table saw, really just because of how long the pieces were. I didn't think I would have room on my workbench to fit them. Again, the idea is to have 2 waterfall edges on the top and then a recessed in bottom and back panel. I was keeping the desk pretty simple here and just having 2 drawer compartments side by side, and here I'm cutting a groove for the vertical divider into the top and bottom panels by making multiple passes with a track saw. Would have been easier on the table saw, but these pieces were just a little bit too big. The dado stack was definitely pulling its weight for these builds after adding in rabbets along the bottom and back edges to allow for the recessed panels. I used tape for the waterfall edges, and I'm not using any kind of special tape. This is just some heavy-duty packing tape. And even for the larger pieces like this, it's doing a really great job keeping those 45-degree edges nice and tight. One caveat, now that I think about it, I cut these actually at 45.5 degrees, and this leaves a small gap in the miter to allow a bit of space for the glue, but mainly it just helps to make sure that the miter doesn't open up when you fold them together. The width of the bottom panel is really what's driving the final angle of the waterfall edges after I clamp everything up, so having the cuts slightly larger than 45 degrees won't create an issue in this case. Another nice thing to have, or really an essential thing for a glue up like this, is some nice long pipe clamps. This desk ended up being wider than any of the parallel clamps I owned. Both pipe clamps, you can just buy the longer length pipe and they still work great. If you plan on doing any kind of work like this and don't own them already, definitely pick up some pipe clamps and parallel clamps. They have paid for themselves 10 times over since I got them. One of the joints opened up a little bit during the glue up, but the edge of a screwdriver closed those gaps right up. I used the same white oak chamfered edge banding that I used for the nightstands here on the desk for the outside edges, and just for that middle divider I used a flat piece of white oak, just cut a little bit thinner. I just used glue and pins to install everything, and I came back later with some wood filler to fill those tiny little holes left by the pins. I also quickly added some trim onto the back side of the desk to cover up any exposed MDF edges. Maybe not necessary since this side won't be seen, but good art. For finish of the desk and the nightstands, I decided to go with lacquer, and I use a 3:1 ratio of lacquer to lacquer thinner when I'm using an HVLP sprayer. For these, I ended up doing 3 coats total, just making sure to sand lightly in between each coat, and really makes for a nice durable finish with lots of sheen. I made 2 drawers for the desk the exact same way I did for the nightstands, just a bit longer and wider. And for the drawer fronts, I am using more of that white oak with the 4 purple heart stripe inlays just to match all the other furniture pieces for this set. I had a small issue here. When I went to put one of the drawers in, it was about a 1/16 of an inch too wide. And since the glue had already dried on this one, I just took it over to the jointer to take off a little bit of material, and that did the trick. After getting the drawer fronts mounted with that inset look, I got to work on the legs for this desk next. I went back and forth on whether I should make the legs or just buy a couple. And there are actually a lot of really cool looking legs out there on Amazon and other sites, but I had some extra material and decided to design something that would roughly match the style of these furniture pieces. Basically what I came up with was having a black stained square about the width of the table, and then to fill the middle empty area I would have a couple white oak boards flipped perpendicular to the other vertical boards. And these would be there just to provide some extra support and also have the same matching color to the main part of the desk. For the joinery, I am using the dominoes, and these did an amazing job keeping everything aligned during the glue up. Really kind of a perfect use case for this kind of a tool. Also, I showed it a second ago, but I did add these little 2x4 spacers at the top of the legs to add a bit more height because my initial cuts came up about an inch or two short, and my thighs were hitting the desk when I scooted in the chair. It's definitely not ideal doing a glue up after the stain is already on, but I didn't know any way that I could stain afterwards and keep those metal boards from getting any stain on them. And this was definitely the look I was going for. I wanted to keep those contrasting wood colors. So I just had to make sure to scrape as much of that squeeze out glue that I could during the glue up part. I actually ended up really liking how these legs came out, though definitely not a look for everyone. But I think it kept that modern theme I was going for all this furniture. I don't know, I could also see people calling it too boxy or simple, and that'd be valid. But in any case, they do an adequate job holding up the desk, and all I did to mount them was add some screws in from the bottom, and this desk was all done. With the desk done, I circled back to the nightstands, and unfortunately the floating look I was going for was out the window due to some circumstantial challenges, so I made a quick compromise and picked up legs off Amazon. Even though it wasn't my first choice, I did like how the nightstand looked with these little 6-inch rounded legs, which propped them up nicely. And after adding some HGTV flair to the furniture, these pieces were finally done. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will see you on the next one.